इंडिया स्पीक्स डेली को सब्सक्राइब करें, उसके बेल आइकन को ज़रूर दबाएं यदि आपको इसकी पत्रकारिता पसंद हो। धन्यवाद।
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to India Speaks Daily. The Hong Kong protests have officially completed a period of 6 months. And this is a big thing, a big news, that despite crackdown by the police, despite increased surveillance by China, and despite increased use of brute force by the Hong Kong police authorities, the protest movement has gone on for so long, and that it has indeed entered a period of 6-month phase. It has indeed managed to cross the time frame of 6 months. About 8 lakh protesters from all age groups held peaceful demonstrations across Hong Kong in solidarity with the Hong Kong's protest movement, in solidarity with the Hong Kong's frontline protesters, and reiterated their demands for universal suffrage, universal voting rights, a demand for democracy, as well as an inquiry into the use of brute police force by the Hong Kong police, and also finally a demand for getting out of the communist clutches of the Chinese regime. And as the Hong Kong protest movement gains further momentum, and it's commendable, it's a rather surprising fact that it has gone on even after the Hong Kong elections, in which the pro-democracy candidates won by a huge margin. So after the Hong Kong elections, everybody was sort of hoping, China was sort of hoping rather, that the movement would die a natural death and the movement would gradually wither away. But what has happened is the exact opposite. The Hong Kong protest movement has rather sort of multiplied. The number of protesters have multiplied in numbers, and not just the number of protesters have increased, but also people from all age groups are joining in the protests now, including middle-aged people and old people who were till now sort of a bit apathetic to the movement, who were till now a bit scared of joining this movement because they were scared of sort of directly upfronting the Chinese government. They were scared of coming in direct confrontation with the Chinese government. But now this chimera is breaking, and people from all age groups are joining the Hong Kong protest movement. Although even now more than 50% of the protesters are under the age of 30, but at least the perception is changing, and the older people, even if they are not directly participating in the frontline protests, are now helping the younger protesters, helping the younger Hong Kongers to sort of by giving them shelter, food, and also by way of giving them sort of moral courage. So the movement is consolidating the citizens of Hong Kong now to a huge extent. Yet another interesting feature of the Hong Kong protest movement, one that is emerging and one that has been consistent throughout, is the absence of a centralized leadership. 6 months after the protests officially began in the month of June, and even after a period of 6 months, the leadership still largely remains decentralized. There is no identifiable leadership, no public face of the Hong Kong protest movement as such. And one of the reasons behind this is obvious, that the frontline protesters, a large number of them are young people, very young people. In fact, many of them are under the age of 18 years. So they obviously don't want their parents to know about their identities, because a lot of them have hidden from their parents as well, that they're playing such an important, they're playing such a paramount role in these protests against the Chinese government in Hong Kong. Another reason, and a more dangerous reason, a more worrisome reason, is that the protesters, despite the fact that the movement has gained so much of international legitimacy, despite the fact that the whole world is talking about the human rights abuses inflicted by the Chinese government on the Hong Kongers, the protesters still feel compelled to hide their identity because they're scared of a possible clampdown by the Chinese government. They're scared of the secret surveillance systems of the Chinese government, which would eventually track them down. They could be in prison or possibly suffer a fate even worse. So this is amazing and a telling commentary on China's history of human rights abuse, that the terror of the Chinese communist regime is such that the Hong Kong's young protesters are still scared of revealing their identities. And not just that, they're even scared of meeting out journalists. They're scared of giving any kind of information to journalists. And even if they do meet any journalists, the meetings often take place in very secret places. The meetings often take place in very secret circumstances. Talking about China, yet another new development that has happened is the international panel of experts that had been hired by the Hong Kong government to advise the Hong Kong police watchdog over its mishandling of the protests has now announced a decision to withdraw. Now, the panel has publicly declared that it will no longer be involved in the consultation process. Now, a bit of background to this. As international pressure is increasingly building onto China to pay heed to the demands of the protesters, it has done cursory lip service to the demand for inquiry into police brutality by saying that Hong Kong's Independent Police Complaints Commission would investigate the matter. And the experts hired to advise the watchdog have now quit, saying that the watchdog, the police body, does not have enough investigative powers, it does not have enough teeth, and it is a mouthpiece of the Chinese government. Now, to the Chinese government, this is a huge setback, as it lends further strength, further credibility to the already building up international pressure, to the international pressure that is already building up against the Chinese government over its alleged mishandling of the Hong Kong protests, over its alleged use of brute force to quell the protests. So this has only added fire to the public opinion that is already building against China vis-a-vis Hong Kong protests, and now it's becoming more and more difficult for China to ignore the demands of the Hong Kongers, and it is becoming more and more difficult for China to sort of ignore the pressures of the international community. And as the Hong Kong protest movement further gains momentum, it shows no signs of dying down. It would be interesting to see how a communist China copes with Hong Kong's demands for democracy. Thank you.